an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This old adage is especially relevant when it comes to fraud, and there is no better way to fight fraud than to prevent frauds from occurring in the first place. Effective anti fraud controls, reviewed and tested periodically, are proven to prevent and deter fraud. In our podcast, we will discuss fraud prevention techniques based on the findings from the Report to the Nation 2024 published by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, or ACFE. Our speaker today is John Gill, President of the ACFE. John began his career at the ACFE in 1995 as its first general counsel. He then created and was the first director of the ACFE's Research and Publications Department. John most recently served as Chief Training Officer, where he oversaw all of the ACFE's training activities. In 2006, John developed the CFE exam review course, which he has taught on 6 continents. He has also conducted training for Fortune 50 companies, federal, state, and local government agencies, and professional organizations across the globe. John is a co author of the Fraud Examiner's Manual. He is the former publisher of the Fraud magazine and remains a regular contributor to the magazine. John graduated from the University of Arkansas with a bachelor's degree in English. He earned his Doctor of Jurisprudence with honors from the University of Texas School of Law. A very warm welcome to you, John, for our podcast. We start off with, in your experience, what are the most common anti-fraud controls and how effective are these anti-fraud controls?
Yeah, thank you for having me on your podcast, and it's quite an honor. And we were just talking, you were served on our ACV Board of Regents. It's been several years, and so glad you're still. It was a good chance to hook up, and appreciate your service to us and the ACFE members. Yes, we do a very extensive survey of our members every 2 years, and then we publish the results in a document called the Report Occupational Fraud, a Report to the Nations, and that is free on the ACFE website. So if you go to acfe.com/RTTN, you can see the report, and there's a PowerPoint presentation with a lot of the findings, infographics. There are all types of things that, as we go through some of this, if you think some of this would help your listeners in their jobs, then all of this is free, and they are welcome to it. But we ask, well, what types of controls do you have in your organization to help prevent fraud? And it gives you a sense of what the top answers are: codes of conduct, external audits of financial statements, internal audit department, management certification of financial statements, management review, external audit of internal controls, or financial reporting. A lot of those should, and then hotlines was right after that. A lot of that should sound familiar because in many countries that's required. Companies are doing these things, I think, often because they're required, not as much in the idea of trying to stop fraud. Because if you go from the bottom up, rewards, these were the least, starting from the least used and going up from there. Least was rewards for whistleblowers, job rotation, mandatory vacations, surprise audits, proactive data monitoring, formal fraud risk assessments, a dedicated fraud department. Those are at the bottom, but they should be at the top. And so that's one of the things that concerns us when we do the survey is, I think sometimes companies are doing the minimum or just doing what's required. But those things, like being more proactive with surprise audits and doing risk assessments and monitoring, I think is extremely crucial but anything you do helps, because what we do find is if you have any controls in place, you're better off. The more controls, the better. But if you have controls in place, our survey reveals every year that the fraud losses are lower and we catch them quicker.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you're saying that there is a direct correlation that anti-fraud controls have on early detection and magnitude of losses caused by fraud.
Yes, that's correct. Just to give you a few numbers, and we have this all laid out in the report, but for example, surprise audits is one that's frequently reported. For companies that had that control in place, the median loss was 75,000 as opposed to 200,000 for companies without that. So there's a 63% reduction. Companies with a hotline, it was about half. It was 100,000 versus 200,000 without that particular control. The detection side, looking at going back to surprise audits, it was again about half. If the company had surprise audits in place, detection was 9 months versus 18 months without that control. Hotlines, 12 months versus 24 months. So looking at it broad, and like I said, we have it broken out by control, but if you just look at everything, you could basically say, yes, if you have controls in place, your median losses are going to be half what they would otherwise, and you're probably going to catch it twice as fast.
So then, what have organizations learned from these fraud prevention techniques? Obviously, faster detection and lesser magnitude of losses. But is there any insight from the study in terms of changes that organizations have made to their internal control framework based on their own experience in how effective the anti-fraud controls were?
What we're seeing that bears out in the report, but also when I'm talking to people out in the field, one of the biggest things that you can do, in addition to really strengthen and have your internal controls more robust, is to add fraud awareness training in there somewhere. And this is good timing because Fraud Awareness Week is I think it's the third week in November. And so that's coming up. But the employees they are your eyes and ears, and I think employees are often willing to participate and willing to help you with fraud prevention and detection, but often they don't understand what they're supposed to do. They don't know the red flags, and they also don't know if you really want to know about it. I've talked to people where, well, yeah, we had a hotline, we asked people to talk to us, but they got the impression that, well, they didn't really want to know and they just had to have the hotline for some reason. So it's really is, if you got to have good internal controls, but if you can couple that with fraud awareness training to explain to the employees what your anti-fraud message is, what your policies are, and what to do when they find a fraud, that goes a long way into really making those controls work.
I think the report also talks about the passive detection versus active detection methods. So, could you explain to our listeners the concept and the difference between passive detection and active detection methods?
The classic passive detection is what I just mentioned, is having a hotline. So there's a way for employees to contact you in the case of finding fraud or just noticing something that seems wrong. And that's also fraud awareness training, is explained to employees that, look, it's not just often they think I have to have a provable case, like something you would take to the police department. It's like, I just see something that looks strange. It's like this purchasing manager has an unusually close relationship with one of our vendors. They're very friendly. They go out all the time. They're favoring this vendor whenever there's a contract or a purchase that we're going to do, and it just doesn't look right. That's something that the company should know about. That's something that we want them to come forward. It's not anything you can go to the police department about, but that's why you have internal reporting. So extremely important to have passive, which is you're not auditors, fraud examiners aren't doing anything. They put that out there. They want the employees to come in, but part of being active is you can't just have that. So you can't just sit back and say, all right, well, we put in a hotline, and if it ever, if it rings, we'll investigate it, but otherwise we're good. We don't have to do anything else. As you know, that you have to be out in front of it. And these are things like doing data analytics and doing continuous monitoring, doing audits. I think doing employee training is also part of being active. So you need both. You need passive methods, which is you've got employees, and it's not just employees, it includes vendors, customers, employees. They notify you if they see something wrong, but at the same time, you're out there in front of it trying to do training, conduct audits, doing monitoring, doing data analytics.
Okay. So we're saying then that complaints which come through a whistleblower hotline would be passive detection. And it's no surprise, I think, that every report to the nations, including the latest one in 2024, indicates that more than 40% of fraud cases were uncovered due to a tip from a whistleblower. And tips seem to be the most common form of fraud detection. Is there further insight you could share, John, on who is submitting the tips or complaints? How are they submitting these? And to whom was the initial reporting done?
Sure. Yes. The first year we asked that question, we were a little surprised that overall, when you look at across the globe, 43% time our members were saying we found out about the fraud through a tip. Internal audit drastically below that's 14%. Management review is 13%. Document examination 6%. It goes down from there. But that's not to say that auditors or anybody are doing anything wrong. Just the opposite. I think if you have educated employees, your customers, vendors, and they're willing to come forward and tell you something, that's great. But it does prove the point that just having an audit department alone is not going to be enough. You've got to get the employees and the customers on your side. And that as to who is making the report, 52% people who made the report or called in with the tip were employees. So 52% were employees, 21% were customers, 15% were anonymous. So we don't know which side they fell on. And then 11% were vendors. And then goes down from there. But actually, a couple, they had 1% was from competitors. And we have seen that before, where somebody bid for a contract and they didn't get it, and they thought there was something strange going on. And so that's why whatever you should be publishing your ethics policy or your code of conduct and putting it somewhere out on your website so that customers, competitors, vendors, they can see what your rules are and how to report something themselves if they see something going wrong. And it's important, I think, to send that message to especially vendors to say, look, we don't want our employees receiving gifts, or if they're trying to solicit gifts or money or any special favors, we don't allow that. We don't do business that way. And here's how you need to report it.
Yeah, I think especially in procurement, that's a pretty difficult issue in terms of gifts and favoritism and conflict of interest. And that's where I think the hotline is a very effective tool, both for vendors, if they don't receive a contract or they've been asked for favors, and even employees, if they've been offered, I think it works both ways. If employees have been offered favors from vendors to push their product, without certain quality approvals. I guess moving on in terms of after the initial reporting, which parties were alerted to the fraud after it was discovered?
According to the survey, after it was discovered, usually management is the first group to be notified. And it could be the management of employee or that department. And that's pretty common because you really a lot of times employees are not comfortable with going, let's say, the general counsel's office or to the chief audit executive and making allegations about other employees. That would be, a scary thing to do because they're thinking, well, what if I'm wrong? They're going to blame me, and so where should I go? And so that's why usually when the hotline tip comes in, if they can get the person to not be anonymous and put their name on it, then they'll refer them to a member of management to discuss it. And it's important to do the training with management to find out, well, how do they need to approach it and what do they need to do? And also, they need to be trained not to do the investigation themselves. Fraudster that I interviewed, his name was Nathan Mueller, worked for ING Financial Services Company, who's worldwide, and this office was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. So Nathan's coworker suspected there was a company they were making payments to. The records show that she had approved these payments, but she knew she hadn't. She didn't even know who this company was. So she goes to the head of their department and says, "Look, I'm concerned about this. I don't know who this company is. It says that I approved these payments, but Nathan was the one who set them up in the system. It's Nathan's account, so somehow he must be involved." So the manager just called Nathan and said, "Hey, we have a question about this account. Can you bring in the files and the records on it?" And this was on a Friday afternoon. And he said, "Oh, well, my assistant's out. I don't know where that is. Do you mind if we do this next week?" And the manager was like, "Sure, no problem." Well, over the weekend, Nathan came in and he was destroying documents. He was shredding documents. He was trying to fake up new documents. So this is why you have to train the management. If the report comes to them, they need to know what to do and what not to do. And if they've not been trained on doing an investigation, then that's not something that they should just take off on their own, because it gives the fraudster the opportunity to hide or manipulate or destroy evidence. So I think it's up to the manager to decide, where do we go from here? And this depends on the structure of the company. It could be the internal audit is responsible for doing investigations. It could be that it rests in the legal department, or it could be that they have an outside company that they use to do these types of things. So it's also training management, since they're the ones that are learning about this. Often the reports are going to them to know what to do. But then after management's internal audit, and then legal, and then next is a fraud investigation or forensic specialist, and then after that is a board of directors.
Well, I know you talked about earlier about fraud awareness and training programs. So I think now listening to your comment on even management has to be trained in terms of what to do when they receive a complaint. So it seems like it's critical that management also has to be trained. So, what kind of training would you recommend or suggest to train employees, managers, and others, in leadership roles about
Right.
the risks and costs of fraud, both awareness and what not to do in the initial stages as soon as a fraud is discovered?
It's a good question, and we're trying to practice preach at the ACV, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and on our website, acv.com. You go to fraud resources. We've just added a new section on fraud awareness training, and so we're trying to provide some resources to organizations that they can use, kind of start the ball rolling with their own fraud awareness training. So they're giving some place for companies to start, but also it may be that you want to look for assistance. You can hire someone to come in and help you do a good fraud risk assessment and do a plan for fraud awareness training for employees without a great deal of expense. And I think people think, well, this is, be like, super expensive, but you can tailor it to your organization and the types of risks that they think you're going to face. So it certainly is something that if you have well-trained people, there are resources out there that they can use to help them do this on their own internally. But if not, then I would suggest maybe looking for somebody on the outside to kind of consult with you a little bit to help you do some training, or at least guide you in the right direction so that you know that you're doing it correctly. Because there's two prongs, as you said. It's educating employees about, here are the types of fraud that companies are vulnerable to, here are the red flags, and here's how to report it. It's also educating management on, part of your responsibility in approving invoices or approving contracts or approving timesheets. Here are the things that you should be looking for. And if you do get an allegation or you see something that looks strange or suspicious, then here's how you should proceed and here's how you should report it.
Well, that's excellent news for both, I think, employees and management. So even employees can be reassured that the management whom they're reporting to is cognizant of fraud risks and knows what critical steps to take, and most importantly, what steps not to take. But moving on, I guess, in terms of, we often hear that establishing an effective controls framework, especially anti-fraud controls, is quite expensive. Are there any suggestions on anti-fraud controls that would work for small businesses and startups, entities which are mid-sized, don't have large budgets? What would you recommend for those types of organizations?
Well, we ask organizations, small organizations, well, what were they doing to try and prevent fraud? Some of the responses we got were they were using codes of conduct, management certification of financial statements, and also just management being involved in the day-to-day process. And I've seen that problem many times personally with small organizations. Management will, if owners of the company, let's just, go that route. If you have a small company, you have usually the people who started it, but they're not just sitting back at a desk all day. Usually they're out there performing the work. They're trying to grow the business. They're trying to make contacts. They're trying to be a salesman, or they're whatever the work is. They're out there actually trying to do it during the performance. Often they don't want to be bothered with things like accounting and invoicing and employee issues. And so they keep delegating that to other people. And so what we see often, especially accounting, is they have no insight and there's no oversight on the accounting function. They say, well, here's all our money. You're responsible for paying our bills, paying our employees, paying our vendors, and we're just going to let you handle it. And they never ask any questions. They never look at the payments that are being made. They never look at any of the electronic payments. Where's the money going? And that is a recipe for disaster. Even if you don't understand everything, owners of small companies and management of small companies needs to regularly meet with those in charge, those who are performing the major functions of the company, particularly finance and accounting, and ask questions. That it's that perception of detection that's so important. And that goes such a long way with preventing fraud in small companies. If you know that the owner is looking at who we pay, looking at our vendors, asking questions about it, then people in accounting and finance are less likely to try and steal. Most of the cases that I've seen in small companies, it was an accountant, and they would usually set up a shell company and they would make payments to a shell company, and they knew they could get away with it because no one ever asked any questions ever about these vendors and what were we buying and who they were, if this was needed. So having a code of conduct that you can give to employees and make sure that they understand what the rules are, that's you can find many draft forms or frameworks that you can use to do that. Asking questions doesn't cost any money, and it's a good thing. that you could be doing that on your own. And hotlines are not that expensive. A lot of companies think, oh, well, this is expensive to do, but you can hire third-party firms to answer a hotline. It usually, at a very reasonable cost for small companies. And again, going back to fraud awareness training and just training employees about, and you could do that on own using, like I said, free resources that are out there. That really the bottom line is just understanding what the red flags are for your type of business and telling employees what that is and telling them what to do when they find it. And often employees will, be on your side if you'll just kind of put them in the right direction.
Well, those are some very useful tips for small businesses. I think just two last questions. One, of course, being in India and being in Asia, we're very keen to know whether there are any significant variances that the report has survey has noticed in fraud prevention and detection in Asia versus rest of the world, for example.
Looking at Southern Asia, which we define as Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, we've separated those out as one group. We'll say higher than the world average is 74% of the cases that we receive from that area were corruption cases. So that would be something for everyone in that area, when you're doing your fraud risk assessments, is be looking like, yes, this is should be a major area of concern. And it's not isolate this Southern Asia by any means. I was just in Latin America and I did several presentations in Chile and Peru and Colombia. And it's also, corruption cases are very high there as well. It probably would be in the US if we didn't have so many laws against it. I think that's just it, is the government here had really cracked down on that. And US companies, I think, are really under the gun about reporting. And it risen within organizations fighting it more. I don't think that that aggressiveness is present in some other parts of the world, just because there's too many other things going on. And so if you look everywhere, yes, corruption cases, that's a large percentage out of the total that they're reporting. Next was non-cash theft, meaning they were stealing equipment, inventory. They were 31%. And then 22% were the next largest category were billing schemes, which are like usually set up a shell company, some kind of false invoicing scheme. But once again, tips were the main way that it was detected. 49%, or basically half of the cases, were found out through tip. A second was internal audit, 14%. We'll say one encouraging thing, though, that when I was looking at just Southern Asia, is that when we asked them, were they able to get the funds back, 49% actually were able to recover something. It was either recovered, 9% recovered all, 40% made a partial recovery, 51% recovered nothing. But in the US, it's like 60% recovered nothing. So that may seem like a small difference, but it's pretty big. It's one of those things, like if you can get some of the money back, that's good. So I think often, sometimes with corruption cases, they don't spend the money, or they gave them a gift or something, that may be able to get those things back. But those were the biggest differences that I saw in Southern Asia versus the rest of the reporting countries.
Well, that's very interesting. And I think that goes back to your point you made earlier, I think when we first started the discussion, that early detection and having strong anti fraud controls, I'm sure, plays a significant role in recoveries of monies too.
Yes, absolutely.
So, crystal gazing into the future, what do you see as the top three hurdles in fraud awareness, prevention, and detection?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And oddly, the first thing that popped in my head when I was thinking about hurdles that companies face, and I think it's working from home is is an issue. And it's not that I'm saying, because we allow the ACFE, we allow our employees to work from home, but what I am seeing is that the more people work from home, the harder it is to instill a sense of loyalty and to instill that sense of culture with the organization. In other words, does go into play. And you think about the fraud triangle, and even in that rationalization component, the fraud triangle says that fraud is more likely to occur if the person has a strong financial need, and then there's a perceived opportunity to relieve that need. But then they also have to have that ability to rationalize it and say, "Well, I'm not a bad person because." And we have seen over the years, like, well, they like the company, they like management, they feel respected, they have this strong culture. People don't seem to want to steal from the organization because they're happy. They get that positive reinforcement of doing a good job, and they feel part of a family, and they don't want to do anything. But I think as we are more isolated, I think that's one of the challenges that organizations have, is to foster this sense of family, this sense of corporate culture, but also it becomes harder to verify transactions. You can't just walk over to somebody's desk like you could and ask them, about something. Well, now you have to set up a meeting, and there are more things that are being done electronically, which makes it easier to falsify or forge documents. And so that, I think, is this electronic separated environment. I think makes fraud detection and prevention harder. The next thing I thought of was, I've been reading a lot and talking to a lot of people more about artificial intelligence, and it has the potential to be a game changer with fraud detection, but it has to be done correctly, and it can be expensive to set up, which is something that companies don't like to hear. It's not something that can be done quickly. Well, let's feed in all of our raw data, and artificial intelligence will find the fraud. It really does not work that way. You have to go back, you have to take your historical data, you have to make sure it's in the right format, that it's been cleansed and normalized, and then you have to put it into your artificial intelligence program. And it's also not something you can just use off the shelf like Chat GPT. It would need to be a closed system for privacy reasons set up within your organization, but you've got to feed it the transactions and then explain what's a good one and what's a bad one, so that it knows what to look for. And then you have to, give it the new data, and then you have to train it on what to look. It was like a child. It's only learning what you tell it. And that's what's so important to understand, is like it's starting from scratch and it's starting new. So you have to feed it the correct data to be able to get the correct results. And that can be time consuming and can be fairly expensive. So that's the hurdle. I think that there's going to be a little bit of I hate to say a fight, but a conflict, I think, internally within organizations. Managers or executives may say, "Oh, yes, I want to start using AI to find fraud in our company." But in order to do it correctly, it's going to take a significant amount of time and effort. But once it is in place, it's going to be worth it. It's going to be, once it's there and it's running, I think it'll be really, really exciting, because if you do it correctly, it can search through hundreds of thousands of transactions almost instantaneously. But you're still going to need the people to look at them, because it's going to make mistakes. That's always false positives, and it takes the human being to look at those and decide, okay, well, is this something we need to tweak the model that it just recognized wrong, or when you look at it, it turns out it was fraud in the first place. But you still have to have people to evaluate and do the investigations. And then the last part, going back to AI again, is just AI, it can be used, as we just talked about. Artificial intelligence is going to be a good tool to prevent fraud, but it's also a good tool to commit fraud. And that's the second, other thing that companies are struggling with, is trying to put in controls and training for organizations to look for example, we finally got, I thought, really good at doing a good job at training people on the business email compromise. If you receive an email from your CEO or your CFO that says, transfer money into this account, that would finally train people like, oh, wait, this could be some kind of scam. This could be a bad actor, so I'm not going to do that. But now they can impersonate the CEO's voice. And so they get a phone call, they can spoof the CEO's cell number. And so they pick up the phone, it sounds like the CEO, and says, transfer this money to the account. I think people start to let their guard down. They now have artificial intelligence systems that can mimic what they look like. So you get a Zoom call or a Teams call, and it looks and sounds just like the CEO. And now they're telling you to move money or to do something else, send them technology, send them plans or design. So it's more sophisticated artificial intelligence is, the harder it's going to be for people in the workplace to detect it. And I was just we had our Canadian conference just last week, and we had a speaker talking about the, deep fakes with photos, and said that there is really, if they do it properly, is extremely hard to detect a fake photo. It's getting, the technology is getting better and better and better. And so we can't, we were saying, unfortunately, we can no longer really rely on our eyes and ears anymore. We were taught so long, well, if you look at it and you see it, then you can trust it. But now we don't know what to trust any longer. And so that's going to be challenge for everyone, both in business and at home, to, like, you're going to go back to the internal, or back to the auditor's slogan of trust but verify. But verification now is going to be a lot harder. You may have to go through several steps. But one thing that can be done, I think, in the short term, I heard somebody say this, and I thought it was such a brilliant idea, and it costs nothing. If that is within your organization, if worried about proper authorizations, you should have some sort of a code phrase, something. No one has the authority to call somebody up and order large transfers of funds or sensitive information or anything like that, that you're going to have to build in procedures, and often they can be just as simple as some sort of code word or code phrase that that you're talking to the person, and they say you can do that with your relatives as well if you're worried about. And we have this in the United States often, where someone will call and pretend to be a grandchild, and they're calling their grandparent and say that they were in an accident or they're hurt, they need money to get back home, and it sounds like the relative. And so they're saying now, like, well, you need to have a code word or something in place that, unless they give you the right sign or the signal, that you know that it's a scam. And so types of things like that, I think we all have to be on the alert for. And artificial intelligence, everybody's talking about it. It is on the horizon, and I think it can be a force for good. We also need to be cognizant or be aware of the fact that, yes, it can be used by fraudsters as well.
I think in the interest of time, I mean, it's certainly a topic for another podcast, I think, on the ethical uses of artificial intelligence. Certainly interesting times for all of us. And sometimes the solution is really low tech or no tech, just
Yes,
like
it
you,
can
like you
be,
said.
right.
It can't be more tech for creating more tech and detecting more tech. Then we're in this cycle forever. So maybe the code seems like a very
I thought that was very
fascinating.
practical. Yes, I thought
Yes.
that was really. Like I said, I didn't come up with that. I heard that at an event, but I have been trying to pass that along because I thought that was a really good idea.
Right. I mean, like a human password. You keep
Yes,
refreshing, and you just have to keep the passwords, the code straight in your head. So that's a
right.
challenge. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, John, for sharing your insights on fraud prevention and detection. Certainly a very interesting discussion and several important tips for fraud prevention and detection that companies can use, especially small businesses, startups, management, employees, and certainly there are free resources at acfe.com that everyone can go and look at. And the report to the nations is also available. So thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you, Vidya, and thanks to the listeners. And yes, if they go to the website, it has some good resources on it. But you're taking the first step, which is listening to this podcast and trying to be aware of the problem and look for solutions. So congratulations on doing that.
Thank you.